Okay.
Over to you, Michael.
And it's my great pleasure to welcome Melani Schroeter from the University of Reading. Looking at the list of names and our participants, she doesn't probably need a large introduction because there are quite a few people who know Melani already. But for those of you who don't, Melani works on political discourse, mainly with a particular interest on meta discourse. And I think we will hear more about that today, looking at the title. And so the floor is yours, Melani.
Okay, thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation. I've been looking forward to presenting here. And yes, indeed, I'm gonna talk about meta discourse, but I'm also gonna talk about my other favorite thing, which is silence. And so I just wanted to give a brief overview because I said in my title that the talk would be about communicative norms and ideals. And yes, I'm gonna look at norms and ideals that pertain to silence versus speech. And I'm gonna start with sort of sketching a broader historical development as to how these norms or ideals might have changed over time. And then look at the relevance for or within those in a post-war German context. And then I come to discussing the development of the new right's meta-discourse about something that they posit are like heavily guarded borders of public discourse. So they have this meta-discourse going on, have had that going on for decades, as I will show, about the limitations of public discourse, about things that purportedly nobody is allowed to say, and so on. So I've examined that discourse in using quite a few examples. So contributions to salient debates that occurred at different points in time, but also key new right periodicals, and also a bit around communication around the AfD or by the AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland, the right-wing political party, and then also some key publications by the new right at the start of this meta-discourse. So this is all the material I'm sort of variously drawing on where I found this meta-discourse about the limitations of public discourse. And so to illustrate that, I'm going to show some examples and some analysis of them, but with these have been chosen particularly to illustrate the longevity of this discourse and the continuities within it. And then by way of conclusion, I'm going to say something about why I think that norms and ideals relating to silence versus speech in public discourse are actually being exploited in this meta discourse. Okay, so moving on. Yes, so I said I would start with a sort of broader look at the broader historical development. So we could say that up until the beginning of the 19th century, there was less of a likelihood that silence would be considered as problematic as it tends to be considered nowadays. So silence was seen as an instrument for the exercise of power. It was used like that, and it didn't seem illegitimately so. Silence was also seen more like a protection of valuable information. Perhaps also as conflict avoidance, and also, yes, as a means or enabling communion with higher power. So there was an unlikely problem. So it was unlikely that silence would get problematized or even scandalized in a public or political discourse. It's a bit difficult to sort of, you have to piece this together from various contributions to communication history. There isn't really a study that focuses on these shifts of such norms and ideals. The situation gets better when we come to post-war German context. But these things start really tangibly changing in the 19th century. So there is an increasing availability and spread of mass media, also consolidating a more notable public sphere and public discourse. There is widening franchise, so the electorate becomes bigger and more diverse. So also that means increased accountability and transparency for the government. There is an increased need for a sustained public sphere for information about politics and political plans, and for participation as well on part of the citizens. So to kind of contribute to that public discourse, to have a voice and make use of it. So also then openness starts to, am I still audible? Yeah. Okay. Openness starts to become a new communication ideal. Also, people think it's less risky to open up. Social hierarchies sort of tend to flatten. And so that also makes openness less risky. And then we have obviously the development of psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, where communication becomes the means to overcome personal or even collective trauma. And then finally, we have the service economy later on, and an attention-based information economy, where communication becomes the means, a means to success with business as well. And sort of the giving way becomes a little bit of a lost art, and also sort of communicative reticence and the appreciation of it. So in this climate, then we get an increasing expectations of communication. And whenever these expectations are disappointed, the result is that we think that a silence is occurring. And as a result of these longer term processes, silencing and restrictions of speech become more negatively evaluated. They become associated with a lack of power, with passivity, with being unsocial, with unhealthy reticence, like bottling up, and a condition following unjust oppression, like a result of having been silenced, and perhaps also like a sign of intransparency in the political sphere. So there is an increasing problematization of the absence of communication, and especially in public or political discourse. Now, this matters also for in the post-war context in West Germany. So I wasn't sure whether everyone here would know a lot about German history, so I just sort of very briefly signposted. We had the Nazi dictatorship between 1933 and 1945, so an extreme control and streamlining of public discourse, but also the exploitation of new means of communication, such as the radio. And then after the Second World War and the demise of the Nazi dictatorship, Allied re-education in occupied Germany between 1945 and 1949 included a focus on relearning, discussion and debate, and quite an explicit one. So then also after the occupation, Germany was divided between 1949 and 1990, obviously, and what I am gonna say in the following for the time before 1990 applies to West Germany. Here we find that the relevance of debate for the fabric of the new democratic state was quite seen even by the commission that drew up the new constitution for the West German state. And studies such as the ones from Verheyen and Meyer, they show that discussion and conversation were seen as means for citizens to relearn and engage with democracy. And they sort of became new communication ideals, not only for people's personal communication, but especially for public discourse. So then this got sort of, these developments were even emphasized and more amplified with the so-called generational revolt of 1968 and the emerging new left that arguably also brought about a liberalization and democratization in West Germany, nearly to the point of exhaustion. So we have this emblematic communicative habitus of alles ausdiskutieren, like to discuss everything to the very end, till there's really not anything to say anymore about the issue at hand. But also it's no surprise that the most sort of influential thinking about the ethics of public discourse by Jürgen Habermas emerges from this German post-war context with all its emphasis after the Nazi dictatorship on re-engaging with democracy and also the communicative implications of that. There are also, like in a broader kind of intellectual turns in academia, for example, there is an increased interest in the links between language use and society or politics or power. So we can see that from the 60s emerging as well. So an increased amount of thinking of the role that language plays for our social relationships and for social maintaining or establishing social hierarchies. Okay, so then I want to arrive at the starting point of my own investigations, which is the early 1990s, which is when this meta-discourse about the limitation of public discourse starts. And we have now already heard that there was like a very pronounced appreciation of public discourse that was supposed to be open, that was supposed to be a plural, so it's supposed to encompass a plurality of voices. So there was a huge emphasis on the importance of public debate and its accessibility to a large amount of citizens, so, or the largest possible amount of voices. And here we have a discourse starting in the early 1990s that claims that public discourse in West Germany is like completely regulated, censored, full of taboos, completely limited, inaccessible for quite a few people, even for the silent majority perhaps. And I would like to now trace how that sort of gained ground, this sort of meta-discourse. So the arrival of the notion of political correctness in Germany happens just after German reunification in 1990. So from now on, I can talk about the sort of whole of Germany as we know it now, which is also a period of wider political reorientation. And when it arrives in Germany, initially there is a lot of reporting about, you know, what's going on in the USA and on US campuses, but it doesn't take long for it to get incorporated into German contexts. So discourses about dealing with the Nazi past, about migration and diversity, and about feminism and gender equality. That happens from 1993 onwards. And it coincides with the more notable formation and emergence of the new right political movement in German post-unification context. So I should perhaps briefly characterize the new right as a political movement. They are the new comes from themselves trying to draw a clear line between them as a political right and National Socialism. But they are tangible not so much by in party political terms until the emergence of the Alternative für Deutschland in 2013, which arguably sort of bundles quite a few of these activists as well, but they are perhaps still better characterized as loose and shifting networks with shifting sort of memberships, think tanks, and convening at conferences. So it's also a bit more intellectual than like out on the streets. So most of the new right, or what they do, becomes manifest in publishing, and that also goes along with their meta-political orientation, which is an idea they got from the French Nouvelle Droite. And so the emphasis for them is to influence the discourse. So we're right again in the discourse business, winning over the minds, and all of these this set of ideas is indeed taken from Gramsci, and so this is their priority. This meta-political approach, rather than having a political party and achieving a certain set of objectives. So they really want to change the public discourse and I suppose the political culture and the political premises even in Germany. So now this notion of political correctness arrives in Germany, and it sort of kicks off this meta discourse that I've investigated here. But before I go into that, I should perhaps also distinguish that this political correctness entails two strands. One is about avoiding discriminatory language when referring to social minorities. So in Germany, this sort of concern can also build on a long tradition of language criticism, including post-war reflections of the Nazi language, but also since 1990, we've got this annual event of the selection of the Unwort des Jahres, so like the non-word, like the terrible word of the year, which is mostly like from political, pertains to political discourse. So there is quite a pronounced public awareness of sort of choices made when we speak, and their social implications and political implications. But sort of from the new right point of view, all these things were like ridiculous. They lead to abstruse replacements of words, and language just scratches the surface and isn't tackling the real problems. Or sometimes it's also like considered like dangerous, like a language policing, some kind of Orwellian newspeak. But that isn't the strand that I'm interested most. I'm interested more in this other strand, which is all about discursive taboos, discursive marginalization, discursive exclusion, about the heavily guarded borders of public discourse. And this discourse in particular is more specific to and more typical of the discourse of the new right. So underlying this is a claim that in Germany, there is a leftist hegemony, a leftist discourse hegemony in German politics and media. And the left uses their hegemonic position to silence the new right and to illegitimately exclude legitimate concerns from public discourse in Germany. And so this is invoking the ideals and the ethics of public discourse established by the left, with frequent reference to Habermas as well, by the way. And we can see that from the start. So in one of the earliest book-length anti-political correctness publications, a book by the authors Behrens and von Rimscher, you can read something like this. So that because of the 1968 movement and their dominance in the media, the left had obtained leadership over opinions, and the application of the politically correct vocabulary served to maintain this hegemony. And then they write, the others, so what they mean is other voices, are being persecuted. Yes, they are not mincing their words, even persecuted. And then they go on, this is all the more tragic since today's left draws on the notion of Diskursfähigkeit, something like the aptitude to participation in public discourse, as established by the Frankfurt School and Max Theodor Adorno, as well as Jürgen Habermas. However, now that the activists of 1968 have finished their march through the institutions, it is exactly this will to a free discourse which is being negated. So we can really see here that they use the left with reference to the ideals established by them of not pertaining to these ideals. This is really the start of an ongoing meta-discourse about the borders of public discourse, about silencing, about what is sayable, about purported taboos, and with recurring reference to ideals of public discourse. So I've just put in here some more recent examples just to show you that basically the same thing that Behrens and von Rimscher write in 1995 is still going on in 2018 and 2017, respectively, in key periodicals, in key new right periodicals. So there are two quotes here, one from the Junge Freiheit, which is a weekly periodical by the New Right, writing something like, those who a long time ago advocated for a discourse free from domination and constantly demanded dialogue have long since lost their interest in debate, but are now only interested in the iron defense of their rule over opinions. So they're just clinging on to power and they are limiting this discourse, whose sort of freedom and limitlessness they use to advocate. And also in relation to purported attempts of left liberals to silence other voices in discourse, we can read in the Secession, which is a quarterly New Right magazine, once they have successfully prevented it, the discourse free from domination, the defining line of the open society, then they are happy about another evidence of having protected the citizen and democracy from a dangerous counter-discourse. So we can see that they also use irony here to portray what they see as the limitation of discourse and the exclusion from it of the new right. So there is another example here from 2018 from the Junge Freiheit. As much as formally free discourse and open debate are seen to be the defining characteristic of our democracy and are constantly being demanded, as much we also witness in a phase of deepening polarization and dissent that the opposite happens. Blockade, refusal to engage in dialogue, exclusion from discourse, if necessary, even with violent means. Okay, so we can really see that these ideals are being invoked here, and they are seen as sustaining a democratic state of affairs, and then they are posited as being undermined in reality. Okay, so I hope this makes sense. I'm just going to skip those examples. and just come to another one that is where sort of elements of the conceptualization of discourse as proposed by Habermas are even sort of being picked apart. So again, 2 examples from the Junge Freiheit, where the criterion of rationality for participating in public discourse is sort of being attacked. So the author writes, only those who speak rationally will be admitted to the discourse, and it is the rational ones who decide who else is rational. Habermas considers himself rational, and he also names the criteria for rationality. These are first, modernity, and second, universalism. Every discourse participant must adhere to modernity. Otherwise, they lose their aptitude to participating in discourse. You can see where this discourse ethic leads, a pretend discussion by a handful of privileged news editors and talk masters surrounded by taboos and threats of sanctions. And another criticism from a year earlier is on the criterion of truthfulness, that anyone who has different views on truth and truthfulness than the members of this elitist discourse community is losing their communicative citizen rights. He may not only, but he even must be silenced. So we can see that sort of even sort of when it comes to characterizing public discourse and how it could be conducted, even those criteria are positioned in a field of like a political power struggle, and basically there is no valid ideal of discourse, because everything gets abused by the left to just secure their own discursive hegemony. So what I find interesting is that when we look at linguistic or media discourse studies of the phenomenon of political correctness, these nearly exclusively focus on the first strand, where it is about avoiding discriminatory language or discriminatory labels for social minorities. And they sort of largely fail to recognize the second point and the relevance of the discourse that started out with political correctness for the new right in particular. So it's like mostly investigated like a very broad public sort of media discourse, and nobody sort of really makes the connection to this political movement there. And they also offer much discussion of like how political correctness started in the US and how in Germany the reporting was initially about what's going on in the US. And there is little investigation of how political correctness gets incorporated into ongoing and genuinely German discourses. Well, I put some exemptions on here to some degree, but then again, those studies largely ignore the phenomenon of the new right and the centrality of this correctness pattern for their discourses. On the other hand, then we have studies of the new right, but they rarely fail to mention the repeated scandalization of the borders of discourse and the complaint to be silenced, but they also rarely acknowledge the longevity of this meta-discourse or the continuities within. And even when they acknowledge the centrality of the PCE pattern, as it were, they don't really focus on it as a central feature of new right discourse. So one example is like the excellent analysis by Friedemann Schmidt, published in 2001, where he looks at a key new right publication that, however, ceased to exist from the late 1990s onwards, it's called Criticon, and he analyzes the discourse in Criticon, but he doesn't, but he looks at their sort of political positioning more widely, but he can't help noticing the discourse about political correctness that is also going on in Criticon. And he, at least I get this really nice quote from him that illustrates just how important this discourse became to them. So he writes, this figure of thought, which culminates in the claim of an acute danger to freedom of opinion through neo-totalitarian tendencies, belongs to the most successful topoi which the new right are able to bring into the discourse in the early 1990s. This claim does not only provide an air of youthful resistance against purported speech codes, it also elevates those voicing it into to the position of guardians of freedom of opinion and pluralism. Therefore, nearly all public statements and campaigns by the new right cluster around this construct in the first half of the 1990s. The term political correctness helps new right intellectuals voice their dislike of the political culture of the old federal republic, which is pre-unification West Germany. So what I find interesting is that also nowadays, we really don't need the keyword political correctness anymore to maintain this discourse about the limitation of public discourse. It's become so established that very often it gets maintained without mentioning political correctness. So now I said I would bring some examples and analysis. So just because people like to know about origins, I just wanted to say that before 1993, references to political correctness in German public discourse are mostly about USA campuses. But then the first notable contribution that sort of translates it into German contexts is an article published in Die Zeit by Dieter E. Zimmer in October 1993. This article has also been analyzed in detail by a scholar called Caster Frank. So he also refers to the USA initially, but then translates the phenomenon into the German context, stating that similar forces and undercurrents are at play here, characterizing the situation as a dictatorship.
Melanie, we can't hear you at the moment.
Okay.
Now you're back. Thank you.
I'm so sorry. Yes, he characterizes the situation as a dictatorship of virtue, thought prohibitions, speech prohibitions, catalogs of undesired opinions, taboo and new intolerance, with new restrictions to thoughts and perceptions. So we can already see that in the first contribution that says, ooh, we've got something similar going on here in Germany. We've got this notion that the discourse is restricted rather than, ooh, they want to replace this word with that word. So really pointing to the prominence of this second strand of PC in the German context. And he also insinuates that political correctness was perpetuated by the left with their frustrated socialist hopes in an epoch of radical political change at the end of the real existing pseudo-communism. So the left are apparently left without orientation, and so they stick to pseudo-conflicts at the symbolic level via PC. So this also points to the specific context in which he's writing and in which PC hit the ground in Germany, which is the post-unification context after the end of the socialist German state And apparently now the left are devoid of any sort of plans and utopias. Okay, I've just been trying to get a view on the time, but because I've got both devices engaged here in various levels and I don't want to mute myself again, can you just tell me what time it is, please?
Yeah, it is 20 to 2 in the UK now, so
okay,
maybe you can wrap up in the next 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay, I will. Okay.
Thank you.
So what is interesting, I think, here is that in the early anti-PC publications, we have clear links between two concerns by the new right, which is, first of all, the denial of a positive German national identity, which is relevant in discourses about the Nazi past particularly. So in early publications that are writing about political correctness, but that make it look bad, we already have like frequent references to a discourse about the difficulty to have a positive national identity in Germany. And this discourse really continues. So I have an example from a later discourse about the Walser-Bubis debate, saying that Martin Walser made a speech relating to dealing with the past that walked along a thin line that separates what you are or what you are not allowed to say in this country about the ritualization and instrumentalization of the Holocaust. So the Holocaust then being posited as a constant reminder of the Germans to sort of keep them meek by constantly pointing towards the guilt in the past. It is also linked to issues of migration and integration of migrants into German society. And this also continues in the Sarrazin debate in 2010. So we can see that then during the Sarrazin debate, there were a lot of references to political correctness, like in these examples here on the slide, where we can see that, again, sort of political correctness keeps being tied in with this with a discourse about migration, and we are purportedly not allowed to say certain things about migration and migrants. And then it also makes a link to gender equality and anti-feminist discourse. And this also continues. So there was a debate about Eva Herrmann and her anti-feminist publications. And she writes, like 15 years after these early anti-PC publications, she writes, many times I asked myself in despair which invisible, dark and paralyzing force must lie over our country so that no one dares to discuss any more entirely natural matters relating to being a mother and having children. So I'm sorry if you see me scrolling through here. But what I also find interesting is then, so we've got these early anti-PC publications, but we also got early key publications by the new right that then also refer to political correctness. So they aren't about political correctness, but they already incorporate that discourse. And one example is the collection Die selbstbewusste Nation, that also has like loads of references to like prohibited zones, tabooing of topics and of groups of people, and these taboos are guarded by some kind of thought police. And this discourse is going on and on in the Junge Freiheit. So the new right are excluded from discourse. There are borders set within a political discourse is to be had, and so on. And there are some more particular continuities within that discourse. For example, that this tabooing in public discourse is akin to a dictatorship and Holocaust. So in Die selbstbewusste Nation, Somebody talks about the Blockwart system of the West German political correctness society and its inspectors, and about some discourse apartheid, and likens this total rhetorical discursive will to annihilation against all constitutive facts and aspects of the own national identity to the total will to annihilation of NS Germany against the Jewish people. And this extreme example continues when Eva Hermann positions herself 15 years later as a PC victim and criticizes how those with different opinions are being dealt with in Germany, and then says, because the fact remains that we Germans are a society with an extremely burdensome and difficult past. So she likens the political correctness to like Nazi persecution. So there are like a number of continuities that I sort of brought along on the slides, but also I've looked at a second key publication, Wir 89er, which has young new right activists talk about their sort of feeling as they go about in the West German society. And again, there are continuities to later discourses in new right periodicals, for example. So what I wanted to really show is that broader and long-term historical developments lead to the potential for the scandalization of silence and silencing in public and political discourse. And especially the constellations in post-war Germany enable even more of a problematization of silencing, discursive marginalization and exclusion, and the purported borders of discourse. So the new right see these opportunities provided by the flexibly deployable collective symbol of political correctness, and they pursue this meta-political approach. They're working away at public discourse with this meta-discourse about public discourse, mainly through claims regarding discursive exclusion and limitation, and thereby they exploit but at the same time undermine underlying norms for democratic public sphere and communicative ideals. So they've been at it for 3 decades now and continuing. I mean, there are, and maybe I leave that for the questions, there are very good reasons to think that they are really just exploiting rather than genuinely appreciating the same communicative ideals that they invoke. So I should probably stop there, and maybe I'll stop sharing for now so that I can see what's going on. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Melanie. That was really wonderful.